So she just found out she was pregnant?
Yes.
Oh, she called us and told us.
Okay.
That she was pregnant again. And it's something that, you know, with her health, she had problems with Bella, she had problems with Celeste, and we were worried about her health. Now, I understand you want to try to have a boy, but we're worried about your health before you have another baby. And they were trying, from what we were told, they were trying to have another baby. And then when she was pregnant, she had, you know, every time she was pregnant, she did something big for Chris. You know, this surprise, you know, go upstairs and read this. And she had shirts made for everybody. She said, you know, we're expecting again or something like that, it said. And he came walking in the house because she had on video. She's got to have 6,000 videos and pictures on her phone. And you see him come in, he was all excited and everything else. And I don't know. And then that Monday when she came back, she told, Chris had told us that she had a sealed letter. So he told her, this was enough, because we kept asking Shanann, what is it? What is it? I don't know yet, Dad. I don't know yet. And we know she went to the doctor before she left. She said, I don't know. And then he said that she had a sealed envelope or a sealed letter from the doctor's office telling them what the sex was of the baby. So I never got to see that from her.
You know, so you know who prompted having a third child? Was that her idea, or was he pushing for it? Do you know?
They were trying to have a boy. He wanted to have a boy.
Okay.
Even though Celeste was a tomboy.
Yeah.
She was a...
When was the last time you talked to Shanann?
Before she left. I can look at my phone and tell you exactly.
Before she left for Arizona? Okay.
And then I just texted her, you know, told her to have a safe trip back. And
how often would you talk to her?
Every day.
Every day?
Every day we'd FaceTime. Didn't miss a day. If I missed a day, I was going crazy without seeing them kids.
But that's when she was at home? Is that what you said?
I FaceTimed them even when Chris was there. So if she wasn't there, I still FaceTimed.
Okay.
Yeah, I FaceTimed almost every night unless I got home late from work and the babies were sleeping.
Okay. But you didn't talk to Shanann when she was on trips, generally?
Some we just text.
Okay.
I never, like I said, I never...
7.5 years. That is how long Chris Watts has been sitting inside a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin, serving 5 consecutive life sentences for murdering his pregnant wife, Shanann, his 4-year-old daughter, Bella, his 3-year-old daughter, Celeste, and his unborn son, Niko. Most people assumed that once the cell door closed, the story was over. They were wrong, because over the past several months, a series of letters written by Chris Watts from inside that prison have been obtained by journalists and shared with the world. And what those letters reveal about how this man thinks, how he sees himself, how he frames what he did, who he blames, and what he believes his future holds, is arguably more disturbing than anything that came out during the trial. Today, we are going to go through all of it. The religion, the women, the blame, the self-forgiveness, and the one detail buried inside these letters that when you hear it will stop you cold. Before we get into the letters, it's important to understand where Chris Watts is now and what his daily reality actually looks like, because it stands in sharp contrast to the image the world formed in 2018. Watts is currently serving multiple life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was transferred there in December 2018, just weeks after his sentencing in Colorado. The move wasn't routine. It was driven by security concerns tied directly to the notoriety of his crimes. In Colorado, where the murders of Shanann Watts and her 2 daughters dominated headlines, Watts had effectively become a marked man. Within prison culture, The individuals convicted of killing children are often at the very bottom of the hierarchy, and sources familiar with the system suggest he was at serious risk of violence from other inmates. Relocating him to Wisconsin was, in many ways, about survival as much as containment. The facility itself carries a heavy past. Before becoming a prison, it operated as a psychiatric institution known as Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Infamously, Ed Gein was once housed there, adding a layer of dark historical context to the environment Watts now inhabits. Not far from him, at a nearby facility, is Stephen Avery, another high-profile inmate whose case drew national attention, further emphasizing that this area has become something of a holding ground for notorious offenders. Inside Dodge, Watts' life follows a controlled, almost monotonous routine. He lives in a small, highly regulated cell, works as a prison custodian, and reportedly maintains a consistent exercise schedule. Over time, his appearance has changed. He has gained weight and lost much of his hair, physical signs of a life now stripped of the identity he once projected. Those who have insight into his behavior describe him as withdrawn and cautious. He reportedly avoids prolonged eye contact, keeps conversations minimal, and remains acutely aware of how other inmates perceive him. Participation in Bible study has become one of the few structured social outlets he engages in, but even there, he is said to maintain a careful distance. This is not a man integrated into prison society. It's someone existing on its fringes, navigating it quietly, deliberately, and with a clear understanding of his position within it. On the surface, his days might seem almost uneventful. Wake up, work, exercise, return to his cell. A routine that, to an outside observer, could appear almost ordinary. But that surface simplicity masks something far more complex, because while his external world is tightly controlled, his internal world, the thoughts he records, the letters he sends, and the way he continues to frame and reinterpret what he did, suggests an ongoing narrative that is still evolving. And it's within that private space, behind the routine and isolation, that the story becomes far more unsettling than the quiet life he appears to be living. Let's start with who Chris Watts has been writing to, because the sheer volume and tone of his correspondence from prison has become a story in its own right. One woman, identified publicly only as Deborah, said she first reached out to Watts in 2022. What began as a single letter didn't end there. It turned into an ongoing exchange that has lasted years. Her experience offers a glimpse into how these relationships tend to form. Initial curiosity, followed by a response from Watts that feels personal, attentive, and disarming enough to keep the conversation going. Deborah is not an outlier. Over time, a number of women have initiated contact with Watts, and in many cases, he has responded consistently. What stands out is not just that he replies, but how he replies. Accounts suggest his tone is often measured, reflective, and carefully tailored. One of the most widely discussed correspondences was with Shanann Watts, an author who initially described her connection with Watts as almost maternal. She claimed she reached out not out of fascination, but from a place of spiritual concern, wanting to understand, perhaps even guide. At first, the dynamic appeared controlled and somewhat structured. Watts spoke about religion, about regret, about transformation. He leaned into the idea that he had become a different person behind bars. But according to Cattle, that tone didn't remain consistent. As their communication deepened, she said the content of his letters and phone calls began to shift in a way that unsettled her. When discussions turned toward his former mistress, Nichol Kessinger, Cattle claimed Watts spoke in ways that contradicted the image he was presenting. She described him sharing details that were unexpectedly explicit and, at times, disturbing, not just in content, but in the casual way they were delivered. It wasn't simply that he was recounting events, it was how he chose to frame them. According to her, there was a disconnect between the remorseful, faith-driven persona in some letters and the tone he adopted in others. That contrast is what makes these correspondences so significant. They are not just communication, they are windows into how Watts continues to construct his identity after the crimes. Cattle also made another observation that cuts to the core of the issue. She believed Watts consistently deflected responsibility. In her view, even when he appeared to acknowledge what he had done, there was often a shift in emphasis, subtle but persistent. Blame would move, sometimes toward Nichol Kessinger, sometimes toward Shanann Watts, sometimes toward circumstances or emotional pressure. But rarely, she suggested, did it rest fully and unambiguously on him without qualification. This pattern is critical because it raises a larger question about the purpose of these letters. Are they confessions, attempts at connection, or are they something more strategic, an ongoing effort to reshape how he is perceived, one person at a time? The women who write to Watts come from different backgrounds, but the dynamic often follows a similar arc. There is the initial barrier, writing to someone convicted of killing his own family. Then comes the response, which humanizes him in a way that feels direct and personal. Over time, that correspondence can evolve into something more emotionally involved. Watts, by many accounts, is aware of this progression. His replies are not random or careless. They are deliberate. He engages. He listens. He reflects back what the other person shares. And in doing so, he creates a version of himself that exists within the confines of that specific relationship. To begin, it's a conversation. And within that conversation, Watts has the ability to guide how he is seen. That brings us to the most important good. The defining theme running through virtually every letter Chris Watts has written from prison is religion. Not as a passing reference or a vague expression of belief, but as the central framework through which he now explains who he is, what he did, and what it all means. In his own words, he presents himself as a convert, a man fundamentally changed, someone who entered prison as one person and, through faith, became another. This idea of transformation is not subtle in his writing. It is repeated, reinforced, and anchored in Scripture. In letters obtained by journalists, Watts wrote that he is a new man, explicitly citing Bible, referencing 2 Corinthians 5:17 to support the claim that his past no longer defines him. The message is clear. The man who committed the murders and the man writing the letter are, in his view, not the same person. That distinction is the foundation of everything that follows. He goes further, framing his identity not through the lens of his crimes, but through forgiveness. He writes that God does not see him as a murderer, but as a child who has confessed and been absolved. And then comes the line that stands out above all others, the assertion that the hardest thing he has had to do is forgive himself. That statement shifts the center of gravity. It moves the focus away from the victims, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and Shanann Watts, and places it squarely on his internal struggle. Not what he took, not what he ended, but how he feels about it now. That framing is difficult to ignore because it reveals how he interprets both guilt and redemption. In his narrative, the act of confession appears to complete the process. Once acknowledged, the sin is, in his view, resolved spiritually. What remains is not accountability in the traditional sense, but personal reconciliation, coming to terms with himself. That's a very different lens than the one the public sees. And in doing so, he introduces a comparison that is difficult to overlook, aligning his suffering with that of Jesus Christ. The implication isn't stated outright in a single sentence, but the parallel is there. A man placed in a position of suffering for a purpose, a narrative of sacrifice, reframed through his own circumstances. That comparison fundamentally reshapes how he positions himself within his own story. It moves him from perpetrator to participant in something larger, something, in his telling, guided rather than random. This is where the language in his letters becomes especially revealing. Because while the words themselves are rooted in scripture and belief, the structure of the narrative consistently centers on transformation, forgiveness, and purpose, all applied to him. The victims are part of the story, but they are not the focal point within his religious framing. Instead, the focus is on what his faith has done for him, how it has redefined him, and how it allows him to interpret his present reality. For some, that may read as an attempt at redemption. For others, it raises more complicated. And within that framework, he is no longer simply the man who committed those crimes. He is, in his own words, something new. That is the version of Chris Watts that exists inside Dodge Correctional Institution in 2026. A man whose story, at least from his perspective, has been rewritten not by time alone, but by faith. If the religious framing in Chris Watts' letters is unsettling, what comes next runs even deeper and reveals something far more complex about how he continues to interpret what happened. Because alongside the language of Scripture, forgiveness, and transformation, there is another narrative running in parallel, one that doesn't fully align with the idea of total responsibility, one that quietly redistributes blame. And at the center of that narrative is Nichol Kessinger. Kessinger was the co-worker Watts was involved with in the weeks leading up to the murders, the person he was building a future around as his marriage to Shanann Watts was deteriorating. In the official investigation, she was never charged with any crime. She told law enforcement she believed Watts was already in the process of separating from his wife, and there was no evidence that she had knowledge of or involvement in the murders. But inside Watts' letters, her role shifts. It expands. It becomes something symbolic. In correspondence with a prison pen pal, Watts wrote that he had always taken full responsibility for his actions, yet in the very same breath described himself as having been misled by a wicked woman. He used language that is not casual or accidental. Words like harlot, references to Jezebel, terms loaded with religious and moral judgment, and, more importantly, terms that reposition the dynamic. Because once that language is introduced, the story subtly changes. It is no longer just about a man who made a decision. It becomes about a man influenced, tempted, led astray. The structure of that argument matters. On the surface, he claims ownership. But embedded within that claim is an explanation that redirects part of the cause outward. He describes himself as weak, as someone whose morals were clouded, whose judgment was compromised by another person's influence. And within that framing, Kessinger is no longer simply part of his life at the time. She becomes a catalyst. In separate letters, including those reportedly shared with other inmates, Watts reinforces this characterization. He describes her in spiritual terms, suggesting she carried evil spirits, again invoking the figure of Jezebel, a biblical symbol often associated with manipulation, temptation, and downfall. He writes about her words as something that responsibility is not entirely self-contained. It's shared, or at least it's influenced, massively in the aftermath of the murders. Her communications, her timeline, her actions, all were scrutinized. And despite that, no charges were ever filed against her. Law enforcement did not find evidence that she participated in or had prior knowledge of the crimes. That distinction is critical because it separates documented fact from personal narrative. And yet, within the internal world, Watts appears to have built for himself. That distinction becomes less clear. In his version of events, Kessinger occupies a role that goes beyond reality. It becomes symbolic, almost archetypal. With the temptress, the influence, the reason things unraveled, and in doing so, the focus shifts. Because if someone else played a role in leading him astray, then his actions can be framed not just as decisions, but as consequences of influence. Emotion, through belief, through the narrative he is trying to maintain. And that brings us to the core issue within these themed. yet still shaped by forces outside himself. And when you look closely, that duality runs through everything he writes. It's not a single consistent story. It's two stories layered on top of each other, one of accountability and one of explanation. And the tension between those two is where the real insight lies. Because in that space, you begin to see not just what he says, but how he needs the story to function. We've covered the religion, we've examined the blame, but there is one more layer in the letters of Chris Watts that cuts deeper than both, and it's not something he says. It's something he almost never does. Across pages of correspondence, across conversations with multiple women, across reflections on faith, forgiveness, and transformation, there is a consistent, almost deafening absence. Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, Shanann Watts, and Niko, the unborn child who never had the chance to live. The people at the center of the crime, the lives that were taken, rarely occupy the center of his narrative. Instead, the focus returns again and again to him. His transformation, his faith, his struggle to forgive himself, his search for peace. If you step back and read through the statements attributed to him, a pattern begins to form. When he talks about the past, it is often filtered through what it means for his present identity. When he references what he did, it is quickly followed by what he has become. And when he speaks about forgiveness, it is not framed around those who lost everything, but around the internal process he has gone through to reconcile with himself. In one letter, he writes that God has separated him from his sin as far as the east is from the west, and that it took him years to find peace, the kind of peace he now holds on to. Years. The emphasis is on the time it took him to arrive at that state, the journey he went through, the resolution he achieved. But within that framing, there is very little space given to the experience of the victims themselves. There is little exploration of what Bella Watts might have felt in her final moments. Little acknowledgement of Celeste Watts beyond her place in the event. Little reflection on Shanann Watts, who was 15 weeks pregnant, preparing for a future that never came. And Niko, a child already named, already imagined, is almost entirely absent from the emotional core of his writing. That absence matters. Because what someone chooses to emphasize, and what they leave out, can be just as revealing as anything they say directly. A forensic psychologist looking at this pattern might not focus on the presence of remorseful language alone, but on how that language is structured. Remorse, in its most complete form, often centers on the harm done to others, the recognition of suffering beyond oneself. But here, what appears instead is something narrower. But what is missing from the story he continues to tell. And when you step back from all of it, the letters, the religion, the blame, the silence, you're left with something that doesn't resolve cleanly. The story Chris Watts is telling about himself continues to evolve. It shifts depending on the audience, the tone, the purpose. But at its core, one question remains. Is this what accountability looks like when no one is watching? Or is it something else entirely? Because behind the language of faith and forgiveness, behind the carefully chosen words, there is still a gap between what happened and how it is remembered by the person who caused it. And maybe that's the part that lingers the longest. Not the crime itself, but the way it continues to be rewritten. So the question isn't just what Chris Watts did, it's how he understands it now, and whether that understanding reflects truth or something more convenient.